In the dead of night, when most people are safe in their beds, some souls stand guard between life and death. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her nursing shift would turn into a battlefield, or that her white uniform would be stained with blood, both her own and that of the soldier she refused to abandon. 7/marks. 7 moments when death whispered her name. 7 times she chose to fight back rather than flee. By the time the sun rose, her story would echo through military corridors and hospital halls alike, proving that heroism doesn't always come in combat boots. Sometimes it comes in scrubs, wielding nothing but courage and an unbreakable will to save lives. This is not just a story of survival. This is the story of a woman who discovered that the distance between ordinary and extraordinary is measured not in miles, but in the split seconds when we choose to stand or run. The fluorescent lights in Ward 7 hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Mitchell checked her watch for what felt like the 100th time that evening. 3:15 in the morning. The graveyard shift at St. Mary's Medical Center had always been her preference. Fewer administrators wandering the halls, less chaos, and more time to actually care for her patients the way she believed they deserved. Sarah had been a registered nurse for 8 years, long enough to recognize the subtle changes that occurred in a hospital after midnight. The building seemed to exhale, settling into a rhythm that was both peaceful and alert. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that she couldn't quite place, a tension that made her check the locks on the medication cabinet twice and glance toward the emergency entrance more often than usual. The wounded soldier had arrived just after her shift began, at 11. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 26 years old, recently returned from his 3rd deployment overseas. The paperwork said he'd been involved in a motorcycle accident on Highway 9, but Sarah's trained eye caught details that didn't quite fit the official story. The pattern of his injuries, the way he flinched when anyone approached from behind, the careful way he positioned himself so he could see both the door and the window, these were the behaviors of someone who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. Marcus had been awake for most of the night, despite the pain medication. His left leg was in traction, 3 ribs were cracked, and a deep gash on his shoulder required regular monitoring. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They held the weight of things Sarah couldn't fully understand, images and experiences that no amount of medical training could prepare her to treat. She'd made it her mission to check on him every hour, bringing him extra blankets, adjusting his position to ease the pressure on his injuries, and most importantly, listening when he needed to talk. Marcus had shared fragments of his story throughout the night, how he'd struggled to readjust to civilian life after coming home, how the simple act of going to the grocery store felt like navigating a minefield, how he'd been riding his motorcycle late that night because sleep wouldn't come, and how the accident had happened when a car backfired nearby, causing him to instinctively swerve off the road. The other patients in Ward 7 were sleeping peacefully. Mrs. Chen, recovering from hip surgery, snored softly in bed. 3. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd had his appendix removed 2 days earlier, was finally getting the rest his body needed. The ward held 12 beds total, but only 5 were occupied that night, creating an unusual sense of space and quiet that Sarah both appreciated and found slightly unsettling. At 3:30, Sarah was updating Marcus's chart when she heard the first unusual sound, a soft scraping noise from the direction of the emergency stairwell. St. Mary's was an old building, full of settling sounds and mechanical groans, so she initially dismissed it. But when the sound came again, more deliberate this time, she set down her pen and listened more carefully. The emergency stairwell was supposed to be locked from the outside after 10 p.m. Only staff with key cards could access it, and the night shift was minimal. Just herself, Dr. Patterson, who was currently sleeping in the on-call room, and James, the security guard, who made rounds every 2 hours. His last pass had been at 3 o'clock, right on schedule. Sarah glanced toward Marcus's bed. He was awake, his body tense, head turned toward the same direction she'd been listening. Their eyes met across the dimly lit ward, and she saw that he'd heard it too. More concerning, she saw recognition in his expression. The look of someone who knew the difference between innocent sounds and potential danger. The scraping sound came again, followed by what sounded like footsteps on the metal stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be trying not to be heard. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she quietly moved toward the nurse's station to call security. But before she could reach the phone, the stairwell door opened with a soft click. 3 men entered the ward. Even in the dim lighting, Sarah could see that they didn't belong there. They weren't dressed like medical staff, visitors, or any other type of person who should have legitimate access to a hospital ward at 3:30 in the morning. They moved with a predatory confidence that immediately set every alarm bell in Sarah's mind ringing at once. The man in the lead was tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed chosen specifically to avoid attracting attention. His companions flanked him. One shorter and stockier, the other young and nervous-looking. All three scanned the room with the systematic thoroughness of people conducting a search. Sarah's nursing training kicked in before fear could fully take hold. Her first priority was always patient safety. She quickly assessed the situation. 5 vulnerable patients, one of whom was immobilized by traction equipment, and herself as the only barrier between them and whatever these intruders had planned. Marcus had seen them too. Despite his injuries, he was attempting to quietly maneuver himself into a position where he could potentially defend himself or others if necessary. Sarah caught his eye and gave him the slightest shake of her head, hoping he would understand that movement might draw their attention prematurely. The leader of the group spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the ward. "We're looking for someone. A patient who was brought in earlier tonight, motorcycle accident." His tone was conversational, almost polite, but there was an underlying hardness that made Sarah's skin crawl. She realized with growing horror that they were here for Marcus. Whatever had really happened to bring him to the hospital, whatever circumstances had led to his accident, they had followed him here. These men weren't random intruders. They were hunting. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The phone at the nurse's station was 20 feet away. The alarm button was even farther. "Doctor!" Patterson was asleep 4 floors up, and James the security guard wouldn't be back for nearly an hour. The patients were helpless. And Marcus, despite his military training, was in no condition to fight. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, positioning herself between the intruders and the patient beds. "Visiting hours are over," she said, proud that her voice came out steady, despite the fear coursing through her system. "You'll need to come back tomorrow between 2 and 8 p.m. The leader smiled, but it was the kind of smile that wolves might give to sheep. "We won't be long. Just need to have a conversation with our friend over there." He nodded toward Marcus's bed. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible," Sarah replied, taking another step forward. "Thompson is under medical care and cannot have visitors without authorization from his attending physician." The shorter man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Listen, lady, we're not asking for permission. We just need 5 minutes with him, and then we'll be gone." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a physical presence. She understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just Marcus's fate, but potentially the safety of every patient in her care. She thought of Mrs. Chen, recovering from surgery and sleeping peacefully just 30 feet away. She thought of Mr. Rodriguez, young and afraid, who'd been asking about his family all evening. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. The nervous young man shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his companions and Sarah. The shorter one took a step forward, his hand moving to something concealed beneath his jacket, but it was the leader who spoke, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Sarah had always wondered how she would respond in a crisis. Nursing school had taught her about emergency procedures and patient advocacy, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when those principles would be tested by genuine mortal danger. Now she knew. She would stand her ground. "These patients are under my protection," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "If you want to reach any of them, you'll have to go through me first." Behind her, she could hear Marcus quietly trying to reach for something, probably the call button for the nurse's station. But Sarah knew that help wouldn't arrive in time. Whatever was going to happen would be decided in the next few moments by the choices made in this room. The leader nodded slowly, as if Sarah had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Have it your way," he said, and gestured to his companions. That's when Sarah noticed the knife. The shorter man drew it from beneath his jacket with practiced ease. A hunting knife with a blade that caught the dim light from the hallway. It was clearly meant for intimidation as much as violence, designed to make people compliant through fear. But as Sarah stared at the weapon, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't backing down. Every instinct screamed at her to move aside, to let them pass, to prioritize her own safety. But stronger than fear was the conviction that had brought her into nursing in the first place. The unwavering belief that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. The patients behind her couldn't protect themselves. Marcus, despite his training in courage, was trapped by his injuries. She was the only thing standing between these predators and the people who had been entrusted to her care. Sarah spread her feet slightly, settling into a stance that would make her harder to move. She kept her hands visible but ready, remembering the self-defense course she'd taken years earlier. Most importantly, she kept her eyes locked on the leader, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Last chance," the man with the knife said. "Step in closer. Move aside." Sarah Mitchell, registered nurse, daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic, woman who had chosen to spend her career healing rather than harming, looked into the face of violence and made her choice. No. The attack came swiftly. The man with the knife lunged forward, expecting Sarah to dodge or retreat. Instead, she stepped into his advance, using his momentum against him while reaching for his wrist. Her hands found their target, but the blade still found hers. The first cut opened a line across her left forearm, a shallow slash that immediately began to bleed. Pain shot through her nervous system, but adrenaline kept her focused. She managed to deflect the knife away from her body, but the attacker was stronger and more experienced with violence than she was. The struggle that followed seemed to last both forever and no time at all. Sarah fought with everything she had, driven not by training or technique but by the absolute certainty that she could not let these men reach her patience. She took a second cut across her shoulder, then a third along her ribs as she grappled with the knife-wielding attacker. Behind her, she could hear chaos erupting. Marcus was shouting despite his injuries, trying to pull himself out of traction to help. Mrs. Chen had awakened and was calling for help. The other patients were stirring, confused and frightened by the violence suddenly exploding in what should have been a place of healing. The fourth slash caught Sarah across the back as she spun away from a particularly vicious thrust. The fifth opened a gash on her leg that immediately made her stumble. But still she fought, still she refused to yield the space between the attackers and her patients. The leader had moved toward Marcus's bed, clearly intending to finish whatever business had brought them here. But Sarah's resistance had disrupted their timeline, created chaos where they had expected swift compliance. The young nervous one was backing toward the door, clearly having second thoughts about whatever he'd signed up for. It was then that Sarah realized the knife-wielding attacker was becoming increasingly frustrated and reckless. His movements were growing wilder, less controlled. She was losing blood and strength, but his anger was making him sloppy. The sixth cut was the deepest, slashing across her abdomen as she tried to position herself between him and Mr. Crow. Rodriguez's bed. She felt her legs weaken, knew she was reaching the limits of what her body could endure, but she also heard something that filled her with desperate hope. Sirens in the distance. Someone had managed to call for help, whether it was Marcus, one of the other patients, or even Dr. Patterson awakening to the sounds of struggle. Help was coming. She just had to hold on a little longer. The seventh and final slash came as Sarah made one last desperate grab for the attacker's knife hand. This time she succeeded in knocking the weapon away, but not before the blade opened a long gash along her neck, dangerously close to vital arteries, but mercifully shallow enough to avoid them entirely. The knife clattered across the floor, and suddenly the dynamic in the room shifted. Without his weapon, the attacker found himself facing a bloody but still standing nurse, a shouting immobilized soldier, and the rapidly approaching sound of emergency vehicles. The leader barked an order, and all three men retreated toward the stairwell as quickly as they had appeared. The entire attack had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had felt like hours to everyone involved. Sarah collapsed to her knees as the adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by pain and exhaustion. 7 cuts decorated her body like a roadmap of her refusal to yield. Blood stained her uniform and the floor around her, but she was alive. And more importantly, so were her patients. Marcus was calling her name, his voice rough with emotion and pain. Mrs. Chen was crying but unhurt. Mr. Rodriguez was pressing his call button frantically, though help was already on the way. As Sarah knelt there, bleeding but victorious, she could hear footsteps pounding up the emergency stairs. Different footsteps this time, the heavy boots of people running toward danger rather than slinking away from it. The sirens were getting closer, and soon the ward would be filled with police officers, paramedics, and investigators trying to piece together what had happened. But in that moment of strange calm between chaos and rescue, Sarah Mitchell understood something about herself that she had never known before. When everything was stripped away, comfort, safety, the assumption that others would handle the dangerous situations, she had discovered a core of absolute determination that surprised even her. She had stood between violence and innocence, and she had not moved. The sound of the stairwell door bursting open filled the ward, but this time it brought the cavalry rather than the enemy. As emergency responders flooded into the room, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full extent of her injuries and the magnitude of what she had just survived. But even as the paramedics began working on her wounds, even as the police started taking statements and securing the scene, Sarah's eyes kept returning to her patients. They were safe. Shaken, frightened, but safe. That was worth 7 scars. That was worth everything. The emergency room at St. Mary's had never felt so surreal to Sarah Mitchell. After 8 years of working in the hospital, she had treated countless patients in these same trauma bays, but never imagined she would be the one lying on the examination table with multiple stab wounds requiring immediate attention. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the head of emergency medicine and Sarah's longtime colleague, worked with careful precision to assess the damage. The cut on Sarah's neck had come closest to being fatal, missing her carotid artery by less than an inch. The abdominal wound required 12 stitches, while the gashes on her arms and legs needed varying degrees of suturing and bandaging. Detective Maria Santos arrived while Sarah was still being treated. A 15-year veteran of the police force, Detective Santos had seen her share of hospital violence. But something about this case immediately struck her as different. Most hospital attacks were crimes of opportunity or domestic disputes that spilled into medical settings. This had been a targeted assault with military precision. While the medical team finished treating Sarah's wounds, Detective Santos began piecing together the timeline of events. The first breakthrough came from the hospital's security system. James Morrison, the night security guard, had discovered something troubling during his review of the footage. The 3 attackers had entered through the emergency stairwell at 3:28 a.m., just as Sarah had reported. But more concerning was what the cameras revealed about their preparation. They had conducted surveillance of the hospital for at least 3 days prior to the attack, learning staff schedules, security protocols, and most importantly, Marcus Thompson's location and condition. Marcus himself was still recovering from his injuries, but he was awake and alert enough to provide crucial information to Detective Santos. The story he told painted a picture far more complex than a simple motorcycle accident. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had indeed been involved in a motorcycle crash, but the circumstances were anything but accidental. 3 weeks earlier, while dealing with his post-deployment adjustment challenges, Marcus had witnessed something he was never supposed to see. During one of his late-night rides through the industrial district, he had stopped to help what he thought was a stranded motorist. Instead, he had stumbled upon a sophisticated drug trafficking operation. The men loading unmarked crates from a warehouse into waiting trucks had not expected a witness, especially one with military training who could identify faces, vehicle license plates, and operational details with tactical precision. Marcus had the presence of mind to photograph evidence with his phone before retreating, but not before being spotted by one of the operation's lookouts. What followed was 3 weeks of escalating intimidation. Anonymous phone calls at all hours. His motorcycle being vandalized. Strange vehicles following him during his trips to therapy appointments and job interviews. The psychological pressure was designed to break him down, to make him paranoid and unreliable as a potential witness. The motorcycle accident had been the trafficking organization's first direct attempt to eliminate him. A car had deliberately sideswiped his bike on Highway 9, sending him careening off the road into a concrete barrier. The fact that he survived was both fortunate and, from his attacker's perspective, problematic. Detective Santos realized that the hospital attack represented a significant escalation in their tactics. When the staged accident failed to kill Marcus, they had decided to finish the job in what they assumed would be a vulnerable location. They had underestimated 2 crucial factors: Marcus's resilience and Sarah Mitchell's courage. The investigation revealed that the trafficking operation was far more extensive than initially suspected. Marcus's photographs and testimony provided federal investigators with evidence of a network that moved millions of dollars worth of narcotics through the port city every month. The warehouse he had accidentally discovered was just one link in a chain that extended from international suppliers to street-level distributors. While Detective Santos worked to unravel the criminal conspiracy, Sarah began the difficult process of physical and emotional recovery. The 7 stab wounds would heal, leaving scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the night she chose to stand and fight. But the psychological impact proved more complex to address. Sleep became elusive. Every unexpected sound in her apartment triggered memories of footsteps in the stairwell. The simple act of going to work required summoning courage that had once come naturally. Sarah found herself checking locks obsessively, jumping at shadows, and fighting the urge to call in sick rather than face another night shift. The hospital administration, led by Chief of Staff Dr. Michael Harrison, was struggling to balance several competing concerns. On one hand, they were proud of Sarah's heroism and wanted to recognize her actions publicly. On the other hand, They were deeply concerned about the security implications of the attack and the potential liability issues it raised. The media attention was immediate and intense. Local news outlets picked up the story within hours, drawn by the dramatic elements of a nurse fighting off armed attackers to protect her patients. By the end of the week, the story had gone national, with Sarah receiving interview requests from major television networks and newspapers. She declined most of them. Sarah had never sought the spotlight, and the attention felt overwhelming when combined with her physical recovery and the ongoing investigation. She preferred to focus on healing and returning to the work she loved. But some conversations couldn't be avoided. Hospital attorneys needed detailed statements about the attack for insurance purposes. Federal investigators required her testimony about what she had observed regarding the attackers' methods and objectives. And the hospital's risk management team wanted to understand how security protocols could be improved to prevent similar incidents. Dr. Patricia Williams, St. Mary's staff psychologist, began working with Sarah to address the trauma of the attack. In their sessions, Sarah discovered that her actions during the crisis had revealed aspects of her character that she was still processing. She had always thought of herself as a caring person who chose nursing because she wanted to help others. But the intensity of her response to the attack, the absolute refusal to abandon her post even when facing mortal danger, suggested reserves of courage and determination that went far beyond routine professional dedication. The sessions with Dr. Williams helped Sarah understand that trauma responses were normal and treatable, but they also revealed something else. Despite the fear, the nightmares, and the hypervigilance that followed the attack, Sarah felt no regret about her choices that night. Given the same circumstances, she knew she would do exactly the same thing again. Meanwhile, the investigation was yielding significant results. Federal agents had used Marcus's evidence to obtain warrants for the warehouse he had discovered, uncovering a sophisticated operation that processed and distributed narcotics worth approximately $50 million annually. The 3 men who had attacked the hospital were identified as enforcers for the organization, with extensive criminal records involving violence and intimidation. The leader of the hospital attack was identified as Vincent Vince Carrera, a 34-year-old career criminal with previous convictions for assault, extortion, and weapons charges. The man who had wielded the knife was Ramon Torres, 28, who had served prison time for armed robbery and aggravated assault. The youngest member of the group, David Kim, 22, had been recruited as muscle but clearly lacked the stomach for serious violence. All 3 men were arrested in coordinated raids that took place 1 week after the hospital attack. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including security camera footage, DNA evidence from the crime scene, and testimony from both Sarah and Marcus. But arresting the individual attackers was only the beginning. Federal investigators were determined to dismantle the entire trafficking network that had sent them. Marcus's evidence had provided a crucial breakthrough, but building cases against the organization's leadership would require extensive investigation and careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Sarah's role in this larger investigation was primarily as a witness to the attack itself, but her actions had broader implications. By preventing the attackers from reaching Marcus, she had protected not just a patient, but a key witness whose testimony was essential to bringing down a major criminal organization. The hospital, meanwhile, was implementing significant security improvements. Additional cameras were installed throughout the building, including the stairwells that had provided access to the attackers. New protocols required additional authorization for after-hours access to patient wards. The security staff was expanded, and all personnel received enhanced training in threat recognition and emergency response procedures. Sarah's colleagues in Ward 7 struggled with their own reactions to the attack. Many of them had worked night shifts for years without considering the possibility of violent crime reaching their patients. The attack had shattered assumptions about the safety of their workplace and forced difficult conversations about risk, security, and professional responsibility. Nurse manager Jennifer Walsh organized counseling sessions for the entire ward staff, recognizing that trauma could affect people differently and that everyone needed support in processing what had happened. Some staff members requested transfers to day shifts or different departments. Others, inspired by Sarah's example, redoubled their commitment to patient protection and advocacy. Mrs. Chen, the elderly patient who had been recovering from hip surgery during the attack, sent Sarah a handwritten letter from her home. In careful English, she thanked Sarah for protecting her when she was helpless and vulnerable. She described how safe she had felt knowing that someone with Sarah's courage was watching over her, even in the darkest moments of the night. Mr. Rodriguez, the young man recovering from appendix surgery, visited Sarah during her own recovery period. He brought flowers and a card signed by his entire family, expressing gratitude that Sarah could never fully comprehend. He told her that his little sister wanted to become a nurse because of her example, inspired by the idea that healing could sometimes require fighting. Marcus Thompson's recovery was progressing well, both physically and emotionally. The knowledge that his attackers had been arrested and that his evidence was helping to dismantle a dangerous criminal organization provided a sense of closure and purpose that aided his healing process. He had also found an unexpected source of strength in Sarah's example. During his darkest moments after returning from deployment, Marcus had struggled with feelings of powerlessness and disconnection from civilian life. The attack had been traumatic, but it had also demonstrated that his military skills and instincts still had value in protecting innocent people. Sarah's courage had inspired him to channel his own protective instincts in positive directions. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed and efficiency. The overwhelming evidence against the three attackers, combined with their criminal histories, resulted in plea negotiations that avoided the need for Sarah and Marcus to endure lengthy trials. Carrera was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Torres received 18 years. Kim, whose cooperation with investigators helped expose other aspects of the trafficking network, was sentenced to 8 years. But the broader investigation into the trafficking organization continued for months. Marcus's evidence, combined with information gathered from the arrested attackers, led to a series of raids and arrests that ultimately dismantled the entire network. 17 people were indicted on federal charges ranging from drug trafficking to conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah followed the news of these arrests with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. Her split-second decision to stand between the attackers and her patients had set in motion events that ultimately protected countless people from the harm caused by the trafficking organization. It was a connection she had never anticipated when she chose to become a nurse. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah gradually returned to her full duties at the hospital. The physical scars had healed well, leaving marks that she wore with quiet pride. The psychological healing was more complex, but Dr. Williams helped her develop coping strategies that allowed her to manage her anxiety and hypervigilance while maintaining her effectiveness as a nurse. The hospital formally recognized Sarah's actions with its highest civilian honor, the St. Mary's Medal of Valor. The ceremony was attended by hospital administrators, her colleagues, local officials, and several patients whose lives she had protected during the attack. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah was when Marcus Thompson, now fully recovered and preparing to start a new career in hospital security, presented her with a military challenge coin. The coin bore the inscription, "Courage Under Fire," and represented the highest form of respect that one warrior could show another. Marcus told the assembled crowd that Sarah had demonstrated the same qualities of selfless service and protective courage that defined the best military personnel he had known. The attack had changed Sarah in ways both subtle and profound. She approached her work with the same dedication and compassion as before, but with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be the last line of defense for vulnerable people. She had learned that nursing was not just about healing, but sometimes about fighting for the right to heal. More importantly, she had discovered reservoirs of strength and courage within herself that she never knew existed. When faced with the ultimate test of her principles, she had not wavered. The knowledge of that inner strength became a source of confidence that permeated every aspect of her life. The story of what happened in Ward 7 that night became part of the hospital's culture and training programs. New nurses learned about Sarah's actions as an example of the highest ideals of their profession. The phrase, "going through me first," became shorthand among the staff for the kind of patient advocacy and protection that defined excellent nursing care. But Sarah Mitchell remained characteristically humble about her actions. When asked by reporters or colleagues to explain her decision to fight rather than flee, she consistently gave the same answer: "They were my patients. Someone had to protect them." As the first anniversary of the attack approached, Sarah reflected on how profoundly that night had changed her understanding of herself and her profession. She had entered nursing to help people heal, never imagining that healing might sometimes require fighting. Now she understood that true compassion sometimes demanded courage, and that the deepest form of caring might mean putting yourself in harm's way for others. The 7 scars on her body told a story of violence overcome by determination, of fear conquered by love, of one person's refusal to let evil triumph over innocence. They were marks she would carry for the rest of her life, reminders of the night she discovered exactly who she was when everything was on the line. Dawn was breaking over the city when Sarah Mitchell first heard the sound that would forever change her understanding of brotherhood, honor, and the far-reaching consequences of a single night's courage. She was at home, Finally released from the hospital after her own treatment, trying to rest despite the pain from her 7 wounds and the adrenaline that still coursed through her system hours after the attack. The sound was distinctive, the synchronized footsteps of military personnel moving with purpose. Even in her exhausted state, Sarah recognized it from movies and documentaries, but she had never expected to hear it outside her own apartment building at 6:30 in the morning. She moved carefully to her living room window, her body protesting with each step. The bandages around her ribs pulled tight as she leaned forward to peer through the blinds. What she saw defied explanation and brought tears to her eyes. A full platoon of United States Marines in dress blue uniforms stood in formation on the street below. Their precision was absolute, their bearing impeccable, and their presence both impressive and inexplicable. At their head stood a Marine officer whose chest displayed ribbons and decorations that spoke of years of distinguished service. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was already on her porch, staring in amazement at the military formation. Other residents were emerging from their apartments and houses, drawn by the unusual sight of Marines assembled in their quiet residential neighborhood at dawn. The officer stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "We're looking for Sarah Mitchell, the nurse who protected Sergeant Marcus Thompson and other patients at St. Mary's Medical Center last night." Sarah's hand went to her throat, touching the bandage that covered the deepest of her wounds. She couldn't understand why the Marines were here or what they wanted, but something deep in her chest told her that this moment was important in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She made her way downstairs as quickly as her injuries would allow, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. As she opened the front door of her building, every Marine in the formation came to attention with a precision that made the morning air seem to vibrate with respect and purpose. The officer approached her with measured steps, his expression serious but warm. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel James Mitchell, no relation despite the shared name, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. We've come to thank you for what you did for one of our own."
Sarah stared at him in confusion.
"I don't understand. I just did my job. Marcus was my patient and—" Colonel Mitchell held up a gentle hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Ma'am, with respect, what you did last night went far beyond any job description. Sergeant Thompson served 3 tours with our battalion. He's not just a soldier to us, he's family. When someone protects our family the way you protected him, we take notice." The colonel turned toward his formation and gave a crisp command. In unison, the Marines executed a perfect salute directed at Sarah. The gesture lasted for a full minute, an eternity in military time, and during those 60 seconds, Sarah felt the full weight of their respect and gratitude, settling around her like a mantle she had never expected to wear. As the salute concluded, Colonel Mitchell continued his explanation. "Sergeant Thompson called our base this morning as soon as he was able. He told us about the attack, about how you fought 3 armed men to protect him and the other patients. He told us about your courage, your refusal to back down, and the 7 wounds you took defending people who couldn't defend themselves." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Anyone would have done the same thing. A Marine sergeant standing in the front rank spoke up, his voice respectful but firm. "No, ma'am, they wouldn't have. Most people would have run. Most people would have called for help and hoped it arrived in time. You stood your ground and fought. That's warrior behavior, ma'am." Colonel Mitchell nodded in agreement. "Sergeant Rodriguez is correct. What you demonstrated last night was the kind of courage we try to instill in every Marine. The willingness to put yourself between danger and innocent people, regardless of the personal cost. That's not a job requirement. That's a calling." The colonel reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wooden box. "This is from the entire battalion, ma'am. It's a token of our respect and gratitude." He opened the box to reveal a Marine Corps Challenge coin, but not an ordinary one. This coin was made of actual silver, with intricate engravings that spoke of its special significance. On one side was the traditional eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps. On the other was an inscription that read, "Semper Fi to Sarah Mitchell, Honorary Marine, for courage under fire in defense of others." Below that were the date of the attack and the words, "7 wounds, 0 compromises." Sarah took the coin with trembling hands, feeling its weight and understanding the magnitude of what it represented. Challenge coins were sacred in military culture, exchanged between warriors as marks of mutual respect and shared values. To receive one from an entire Marine battalion was an honor that few civilians could ever imagine. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't finished. "There's something else, ma'am. The Marine Corps has a tradition of taking care of our own, and as of this morning, you're one of our own. We've established a fund to cover all of your medical expenses from last night's attack. We've also arranged for security assistance if you need it during the investigation and trial proceedings. A younger Marine stepped forward, carrying a large envelope. Colonel Mitchell took it and handed it to Sarah. "These are letters, ma'am. Every Marine in our battalion wanted to thank you personally. Some of them served with Sergeant Thompson overseas. Others have never met him. But all of them understand what it means when someone shows the courage you showed last night." Sarah opened the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out dozens of handwritten letters. The first one she unfolded was written in careful block letters. "Dear Miss Mitchell, my name is Lance Corporal David Chen. I served with Marcus Thompson in Afghanistan. He saved my life during an ambush outside Kandahar. Last night, you saved his life. That makes you family to me and to every Marine who knows what Marcus means to us. Thank you for showing the world what real courage looks like. Semper Fi, LCPL Chen." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face as she read. She looked up at the formation of Marines, these young men and women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting others, and saw in their faces the same determination that had driven her to stand between the attackers and her patients. Colonel Mitchell's voice grew more personal. "Ma'am, I've been a Marine for 22 years. I've served in combat zones around the world. I've seen courage in many forms, but what you did last night ranks among the finest examples I've ever witnessed. You had no training for combat, no weapons, no backup, and no guarantee that help would arrive in time. Yet you fought anyway because it was the right thing to do." He paused, his military bearings softening slightly. "My own daughter is studying to be a nurse. I pray that if she's ever faced with a situation like yours, she'll have half the courage you showed. You've set a standard that we'll use to teach our own Marines about what it means to serve others." Sarah wiped her eyes and found her voice. "Colonel, I need you to know that I wasn't alone last night. Marcus was fighting too, despite his injuries. The other patients were calling for help. Even injured and frightened, everyone was trying to do something. It wasn't just me." The colonel smiled. "That's exactly what I would expect you to say, ma'am. True warriors always share credit and accept responsibility. But Sergeant Thompson was very clear about what happened. You were the one who stood between armed attackers and helpless patients. You were the one who took 7 stab wounds rather than yield ground. You were the one who bought time for help to arrive." Another Marine stepped forward. A woman with the bearing and confidence of someone who had seen combat. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. I've been in firefights in Iraq and Afghanistan. What you did last night was warfare, pure and simple. You engaged the enemy, held your ground, accomplished your mission, and brought everyone home alive. That's what Marines do, ma'am." Sarah looked around at the assembled Marines, feeling overwhelmed by their respect and acceptance. These were people who had chosen the most dangerous profession in service to their country, who had trained for combat and faced enemy fire in foreign lands. Yet they were treating her actions as equal to their own military service. Colonel Mitchell seemed to read her thoughts. "Ma'am, courage isn't about training or weapons or uniforms. Courage is about the moment when you have to choose between safety and service, between self-preservation and protecting others. You faced that moment last night, and you chose service. That makes you one of us." The ceremony continued as individual Marines came forward to shake Sarah's hand and express their personal gratitude. Each interaction revealed something different about the military family she had unknowingly joined. Some of the Marines were barely 18, fresh from boot camp, and looking at her with the kind of hero worship usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Others were grizzled veterans who had seen enough combat to recognize true courage when they witnessed it. Sergeant First Class Robert Washington, a Marine with multiple combat deployments, summed up the feelings of many when he spoke to Sarah. "Ma'am, I've been in situations where people were shooting at me, where I had to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. But I had training, weapons, and fellow Marines watching my back. You had none of that. You had only your conscience and your courage. That impresses the hell out of me, ma'am." As the individual presentations concluded, Colonel Mitchell made one final announcement. "Ma'am, the Commandant of the Marine Corps has been informed about your actions. He asked me to convey his personal gratitude and to let you know that you will always have a place of honor in the Marine Corps family." He handed her another envelope, this one bearing the official seal of the Marine Corps. "This is a formal letter of commendation from the Commandant himself. It recognizes you as an honorary Marine and grants you privileges at any Marine Corps installation worldwide. More importantly, it ensures that every Marine will know about your courage and your connection to our Corps." Sarah opened the letter with reverent care. The language was formal and official, but the meaning was clear. The highest levels of the Marine Corps hierarchy had taken note of her actions and wanted to honor them appropriately. She was being formally acknowledged as someone who embodied the Corps' values of honor, courage, and commitment. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a young Marine, barely out of boot camp, approached her with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "my little sister wants to be a nurse when she grows up. She heard about what you did on the news this morning. She asked me if all nurses are as brave as you are." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I told her that not all nurses are as brave as you, but the best ones are. I told her that if she wants to be like you, she needs to remember that taking care of people sometimes means fighting for them." She said she understood, and she wants to be the kind of nurse who would never let bad people hurt her patients. Sarah knelt down to the young Marine's eye level, ignoring the pain from her wounds. "What's your sister's name?" "Emily, ma'am." "She's 12. Tell Emily that being brave isn't about not being scared. I was terrified last night. But I had patients who needed protection, and that was more important than my fear. If she becomes a nurse, there will be times when she has to choose between easy and right. If she chooses right, even when it's scary, she'll be exactly the kind of nurse the world needs." The young Marine nodded, his face showing the kind of deep understanding that comes from hearing exactly the right words at exactly the right time.
I'll tell her, ma'am.
"And I'll tell her about today, about how the Marines came to thank you personally." As the formal ceremony concluded, Colonel Mitchell made arrangements for ongoing support.
"Ma'am, this isn't just a one-time visit.
"You're part of our family now, and we take care of family. If you need anything during the investigation, the trials, or your recovery, you have an entire battalion of Marines ready to help." He handed her a card with his personal contact information. "This is my direct number. If you're feeling unsafe, if you need someone to talk to who understands what it's like to face violence in service to others, or if you just need a reminder that what you did matters, you call that number, anytime, day or night." The Marines began to form up for departure, but the impact of their visit would last far longer than their physical presence. Sarah stood on her front step, holding the challenge coin and the letters from the battalion, watching as the formation prepared to leave. Before they marched away, Colonel Mitchell gave one final command. The Marines came to attention and executed another salute, this one lasting even longer than the first. As Sarah watched these warriors honoring her courage, she finally understood something that had been eluding her since the attack. She hadn't just been doing her job that night. She had been living up to a standard of service and sacrifice that connected her to everyone who had ever chosen to put others before themselves. The Marines recognized her as one of their own because she had demonstrated the same values they lived by every day. As the Marines marched away in perfect formation, neighbors who had witnessed the ceremony approached Sarah with new understanding and respect. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor, spoke for many of them. "Dear, I had no idea what you had been through. When I saw those Marines here to honor you, I realized that what happened last night was something truly special."
Sarah spent the rest of the morning reading through the letters from the Marines, each one offering a different perspective on courage, service, and the bonds that connect people who choose to protect others.
The letters came from Marines of all ranks and ages, from recent recruits to career veterans, from combat veterans to support personnel who had never seen a battlefield. But they all shared common themes. They understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. They recognized that true service sometimes required personal sacrifice, and they knew that the willingness to stand between danger and innocent people was the highest calling anyone could answer. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a Marine who had been wounded in combat and spent months recovering in military hospitals. "Dear Miss Mitchell, I spent 8 months in hospital beds after an IED explosion in Afghanistan. During that time, I was completely dependent on nurses and doctors for my survival and recovery. Most of them were professional and competent. A few were truly exceptional. But none of them ever had to fight off armed attackers to protect me. Reading about what you did makes me realize how vulnerable patients really are, and how much we depend on people like you not just for medical care, but for our basic safety. You didn't just bandage wounds or dispense medications. You were willing to die to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's the highest form of service I can imagine. Thank you for showing the world what it means to be a warrior in scrubs. Semper Fi. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, retired." As the days passed, word of the Marines' visit spread throughout the hospital and the broader community. The image of a full Marine platoon saluting a civilian nurse became a powerful symbol of respect for healthcare workers and the often overlooked courage required in their profession. The story took on additional significance when it was revealed that Sarah's actions had protected not just individual patients, but a key witness whose testimony would ultimately dismantle a major criminal organization. The Marine's visit was no longer just a gesture of gratitude. It was recognition of service that had broader implications for justice and public safety. Marcus Thompson himself was deeply moved when he learned about the Marine's visit. When I called the base to tell them what Sarah had done, I hoped they might send a card or a small token of appreciation. I never expected an entire platoon to show up in dress uniforms to honor her personally. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But when I think about it, I'm not surprised. Sarah showed the kind of courage that Marines are taught to respect above all else. She earned that salute, and everything that came with it. The challenge coin became Sarah's most treasured possession, a tangible reminder of the night that revealed who she truly was beneath the surface of everyday life. She carried it with her during her shifts at the hospital, a source of strength when facing difficult decisions or challenging situations. But more importantly, the Marine's visit had given her a new understanding of her role as a nurse. She had always seen nursing as a caring profession, focused on healing and comfort. Now she understood that sometimes caring required fighting, that healing might demand courage, and that the deepest form of compassion could mean putting yourself in harm's way for others. The 7 scars on her body told the story of one night's violence. But the challenge coin told a different story. One of honor, recognition, and belonging to something larger than herself. When people asked her about that night, she would show them the coin and explain what it meant to be recognized by warriors as one of their own. The Marines had arrived at dawn to thank her, but they had given her something more valuable than gratitude. They had given her a new identity, a place in a family bound by shared values of service and sacrifice, and the knowledge that her courage had earned the respect of people who understood courage better than anyone. Sarah Mitchell had gone to work as a nurse and discovered she was a warrior. When dawn broke and the Marines appeared at her door, she learned that the best warriors often wear scrubs instead of uniforms, carry stethoscopes instead of weapons, and fight their battles in hospital corridors rather than on traditional battlefields. The Marines had come to honor her, but in doing so, they had also honored every healthcare worker who had ever stood between danger and healing, between fear and hope, between violence and the vulnerable people who depend on others for protection. At dawn, the Marines arrived to say thank you. By the time they left, they had transformed a nurse's understanding of her calling and shown the world what it truly means to serve others with courage, honor, and unwavering commitment. She was slashed 7 times protecting a wounded soldier. By dawn, Marines arrived at her door.